Welcome back. This is The Firm, and our next story brings important news for unlisted companies. The Supreme Court has finally and explicitly confirmed the applicability of the Securities Contract Regulation Act, or SCRA, to unlisted public companies. This has several implications. Paisuni Upadhyay is here with details on the Bhagwati versus Peerless case.
In 1983, the Calcutta High Court struck down a contract involving the sale of shares of an unlisted public company as it violated the Securities Contract Regulation Act, or SCRA. In 1985, the Bombay High Court ruled that the SCRA does not apply to unlisted public companies and upheld the contract of sale of unlisted shares. In 1988, the Calcutta High Court once again ruled that the SCRA does apply to an unlisted public company. In 1994, the Bombay High Court relied upon its precedent of not applying the SCRA to an unlisted public company. At the heart of all these cases was Section 13 of the SCRA that says all contracts in securities are illegal if the parties are not members of a recognized stock exchange. Courts have differed in their conclusion on whether this section intends to include securities of unlisted public companies.
The Supreme Court has taken a view that the SCRA restrictions apply to unlisted public companies, and that was in 2010 in the Naresh Agarwal case, and even before that in the BOI finance case. In 1997, the Supreme Court proceeded on the assumption that the SCRA restrictions would apply in the unlisted public space. So while the conflict between Bombay and Calcutta has been there, I think the Supreme Court's views on this issue have also, while not as expressly articulated in this as in this case, have also been there that the judicial trend has sort of veered towards applying these restrictions to the unlisted public space.
The intention behind introducing SCRA, and this dates back to 1925 when Bombay Contracts Securities Control Act was enacted to regulate purchase and sale of securities in Bombay, which in turn was further extended at national level through SCRA. So the intent behind that act, which was also further substantiated by the Gorwala Committee report, was to regulate the exchanges and to curb the speculation. Now, that the bill that was drafted based on the Gorwala Committee report was used as a base for drafting SCRA. So, most important objective of SCRA was to curb speculation. Now, speculation you can curb, or how do you look at speculation? Speculation can be only if you have a market price. How do you get the market price? Market price is when you have price discovery. How do you get price discovery? Only when there is a liquidity of the securities in the market, which in case of unlisted public companies, even though the securities are freely transferable as per Companies Act, there is no market for the securities.
Having given you the background, let me now tell you about the Bhagwati deal, a transaction that dates back to the year I was born. In 1986, Tuhin Ghosh took a loan of 38 lakh rupees from Bhagwati developers to buy 3,530 shares of Peerless. Mr. Ghosh promised to repay this loan by October 1987, but he failed to do so. He then agreed to transfer the shares of Peerless to Bhagwati developers. Turns out the transfer deed was not properly executed and Tuhin Ghosh continued to enjoy the economic interest on Peerless shares. Bhagwati developers took him to court but eventually agreed to settle the case. Tuhin gave final effect of the sale of Peerless shares to Bhagwati, and in turn, Bhagwati paid him 10 lakh rupees more to avoid further litigation. Bhagwati then approached Peerless to register the shares in its name. But its request was turned down. Peerless argued that the contract between Tuhin Ghosh and Bhagwati was illegal as it violated the SCRA. That's because the consideration of 10 lakh rupees paid by Bhagwati was not paid on spot in exchange of shares as required by the law. Bhagwati argued that the SCRA does not apply to unlisted public companies, and even if it did, the contract was a spot delivery contract and hence valid. But last week, the Supreme Court disagreed with Bhagwati and upheld the applicability of the SCRA to unlisted public companies. To come to this conclusion, the Apex Court pointed to the definition of securities under the SCRA, which includes shares, scrips, stocks, bonds, debentures, debenture stock, or other marketable securities. The Apex Court observed that shares of a public limited company need to be marketable for it to fall within the definition of securities. But the argument that marketability is achieved only by listing on the stock exchange did not find favor with the Supreme Court. The court ruled that it is not the listing that determines marketability but free transferability.
Obviously, there may be other provisions in the SCRA which come up before the court, and as a general matter, certainly they have concluded without any qualifications that the SCRA applies to unlisted public companies also. In terms of what I would be hopeful is that as and when those issues come up, the Supreme Court would look at would consider the SCRA's application to unlisted public companies in a more detailed way, and look at the structure, look at the legislative history, and reach a conclusion that ultimately these provisions are intended to apply only to listed securities. So in terms of whether there are any immediate fallouts for application to unlisted public companies, it's too early to say.
The Supreme Court's order has not only widened the scope of the SCRA, it has also provided a new interpretation for deferred consideration contracts. Section 16 of the SCRA gives the government the power to prohibit contracts of sale or purchase of securities so as to prevent undesirable speculation. The government consequently laid down that only those contracts in securities which entail spot delivery will be valid. Spot delivery has been defined as the delivery of securities and payment either on the same date of the contract or the next day. In the case of Bhagwati developers, some part of the consideration for shares was paid after 6 years, and so the Supreme Court held that since it is not a spot delivery contract, it was void.
In friendly situations, usually all this may not be an issue, but in hostile situations, what can happen if there is one, let's say, financial investor in the company, and on the other end there are promoters of the company, and there is typically for financial investors there is no restriction on transfer of shares. That's how they operate. In that situation, if there is no specific clause on sale to a competitor for the financial investor, and the financial investor goes ahead and sells the shares to a competitor in a manner where there is some kind of a deferred consideration involved, then the board of the company, which if it is controlled by the promoters, can take a view that this was a deferred consideration contract where payment was not made on the same day as transfer of shares, and hence this is not a spot delivery contract and not in compliance with applicable laws, and hence we have the right to reject it.
If you've got a situation where party A needs to sell 100 shares to party B, we try and break it down into tranches. When we've got a situation where the buyer isn't able to consummate the transaction upfront. So you break it down in points of time. One way of structuring it is to ensure that you sell a lesser number of shares for a higher price in the first tranche, and in the second tranche you reverse it, thereby enhancing chances of performance. So I mean, it's not a perfect solution in many ways, and therefore the law really needs to change to accommodate genuine commercial arrangements. But for the moment, lawyers will just have to structure their way around these problems.
In the past, several Supreme Court decisions have examined the applicability of the SCRA to unlisted public companies. For instance, in Sudhir Shantilal Mehta versus CBI, the Supreme Court examined the scope of the definition of securities and held it should be given an expansive meaning. In 2010 Naresh Agarwal case, the Apex Court ruled that the definition of securities makes no distinction between listed and unlisted securities. In Sahara's case, the Apex Court upheld the applicability of the SCRA on an unlisted company as its issue of securities was held to be a public offer. But if perhaps for the first time the Apex Court has expressly articulated the applicability of the SCRA to unlisted public companies without any qualifications. The Supreme Court said that it finds nothing in the object of the Act that warrants a conclusion that the SCRA intended to govern transactions in the stock exchange. Lawyers say this expansive view may also cast a shadow on the validity of put and call options in unlisted companies, a debate that has so far revolved just around listed companies.
Alright, with that we're entirely out of time. You know where to reach us. And here's some good news. For those of you who are early risers on Sunday, the firm is back at that 9:30 a.m. slot on Sunday morning. So make sure you tune in. We'll see you next week.